Hi, this is Rick Cobb with J2N, where we help leaders build change-capable cultures. If you think about leading change, there's probably nothing more complex than the topic of diversity. Today, I have the opportunity to talk with a special guest, Joe Machicote. Joe is a top 100 DEI officer in the U.S. and was recently recognized by Beyond Business Magazine as a top 100 most influential D&I leader. Joe shares his journey from dishwasher during college to Chief Diversity Officer. The questions I wanted to discuss with Joe are, how do you prepare an organization for strategic change like diversity and inclusion? Who's responsible for culture? And if a CEO taps you to lead a D&I initiative and asks you how long it will take, what do you say? When it comes to leading change, Joe's leveraged J2N principles for years. I'm so excited he took this time to share his insights. See what you think. I hope you like it. Thanks for joining.
So yeah, Flick was the food service company that was in charge of my the college that I went to up in New York. And I got to college and they told me I had to do this really dumb thing called pay tuition. And the only way to do that was to get a job and start to save money. So one of the only campus jobs that was still left and available was in the dish room / pot room at the cafeteria. And I said yes, and found out very quickly it was the most disgusting job in the world. It was just awful. I was coming home, going back to my room at night, and my arms were colored orange from my hands all the way up through my elbows from having them submersed in greasy pot water, and it was just gross. And I was really hating the job, and I think that the leader noticed that I was beginning to disengage, and I was beginning to call in and not show up. And he called me in his office one day, and he said, "Do you have any idea how important you are?" And I looked behind me because I was like, "You're talking to a dishwasher. How important could I possibly be?" And he said, "No, listen, I'm really serious." He said, "Nothing starts in this kitchen without you." He said, "You are elemental to this team." And it wasn't until he walked me through that it changed my mindset about who I was. And the word that I use, when I think about that experience is he valued me and he showed me what my value was. And I think that's just a key word, and it's a key role in DEI&B. And he didn't value me based on my color, my ethnicity, my gender, anything like that. It was, what is your value to the rest of the team? And what I gleaned from that really kind of started me on my DEIB journey, because using that mindset to think about how you create a high performing team and showing people what their value is, that is core to the DEIB strategy. Right. So after what that did for me is it really excited me about showing up to work, and knowing that I was part of a bigger picture.
Right.
And what that did was then drove my energy, and they started noticing me. So they put me in the kitchen, and I learned how to cook, and I learned how to, they told me I was going to be a mirepoix chef. And mirepoix in the culinary world just means the person who makes dices celery, onions, and carrots. And you haven't lived till you diced a 50-pound bag of onions, and the tears are streaming down your face. But I was so energized by that, and what it did, it just drove my passion, it drove my energy, and it drove promotion opportunities for me, because they noticed what my personality was in the kitchen, and they said, "You know what, your personality belongs in the front of the house. So why don't you come and help us with students?" So by the time I graduated, I'd run 3 of the venues on campus. I ran the pub, I ran the sandwich shop, and even ran their nighttime jazz club, and all of that so I could continue to pay tuition. And total lack of value. And I was denied a job after going through the training program, literally because of my color. And I that wasn't imagined. It wasn't, it wasn't like that was,
made up.
It was,
yeah.
yeah.
And this was in the 80s?
This was in 1987, 88.
Wow.
And the individual told me I couldn't have the catering job because my customers would not want to work with me.
Wow.
And the customers were primarily white, and they wanted a catering manager that that was going to work for the
Wow.
customers. So they literally told me that, and I left 2 months later. I said, you know what, I'm not going to stay where I'm not wanted, but I still needed to make money, so I stuck around for 2 months. And believe it or not, I went back to the same company that hired me at college because they understood what value was.
The other thing it showed you that's fascinating about you is that didn't deflate you, it didn't derail you, it caused you to kind of rechange your thinking about things, but it seemed like it motivated you. You kept on track. You kept focused on because your goal was tuition and college.
Mm-hmm.
And you were run into sideways, and somebody just tackled you and nailed you, and you got up and boom, kept on going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish. I mean, that's what I try and teach when I teach classes. I do professional speaking, I do teaching, I do coaching. And one of the things I love about J2N is one of the core principles is around valuing differences, and how that actually affects the individual. And here I am live telling the story that
Right.
confirms that J2N's got it right.
Yeah.
Valuing differences matters,
Right.
because it's the difference between a mindset of I want to be here versus I don't want to be here. And we
Right.
know that the mindset of I don't want to be here, if we've ever done a chore or something we really didn't want to do,
Yep.
we know that at the end of the day, we know how it turns out. Exactly right. And when I coach, I ask people, are you going to be the igniter or are you going to be the gallon of water? And if you can ignite people through the things that you say and the things that you do, which by the way, is foundational to trust, and which J2N talks about, respect plus trust equals influence.
Right.
So what this leader did was gain my respect. I trusted what they were going to say, and that allowed that individual to influence me.
Right.
And that's it's a J2N principle, but it's also a human principle.
Right.
If I don't respect you and I don't trust you, you can't influence me. An organizational development perspective, a diversity perspective. And like I said, I like to drive those things together. And I'm a big believer that, companies that kind of have the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and it's separate from everything else, need to think about how we start to incorporate DEI into the fibers of and DNA of the culture of the organization. Because there's a tendency, and I still remember this, an HR person had called me one day when I was chief diversity officer and said, we're having a DEI issue. We need your help. And I said, you're having a people issue. The subject is DEI. You don't have a DEI issue. Why don't I teach you guys, why don't we get together and learn what are the effective principles of how we value this individual and gain their respect and trust.
Right.
And then we can, so it's not a DEI issue, it was an employee relations issue. Mm-hmm. But because it was a person of color, it was like we have a diversity issue.
Okay. So when you talk about, hey, one of the key things you look at and you recommend to leaders is let's not have a separate office. Let's talk about that structure. Is that something you want to say for the second half of some of those key insights of how you start? Okay.
I can talk a bit about that now because I call that cultural engineering, and one of the things that organizations don't do well, every day they're thinking about their finances, they're thinking about their sales, they're thinking about their marketing. But when it comes to culture, it's never really on anybody's agenda. Like, let's have a conversation about how we drive culture as a business objective. It doesn't show up on the agenda. And that's one of the things that I've done in the companies that I've worked for, is made sure that on the executive team, we actually have an agenda conversation about where we want to see culture, how we're going to get it there, and understand that that is all of the underpinnings to finance and sales and marketing And, and quite frankly, if you're a publicly traded company, the vision and image that people have of you and your organization. So it's bigger. It's not just about, how many people we can hire. It's creating the environment, number one, where people want to come to work and want to be hired by you.
Right, but I think as you talk about culture, and let's park there a little bit because it's so important.
Yeah.
If you were to ask me, hey, who owns culture? If you were to ask me that, or ask anybody that, I would think they would probably say that HR owns culture. And we've seen how HR leaders, for the most part, I think they're now reporting to presidents or executives. Part of it really is a focus on talent and hiring, which we know today is a challenge. But I don't know if culture is that specific agenda item. Maybe attrition would be, or the hiring, other things like that. And I'm wondering if is it because culture is hard to measure? Is it because it's just not on the top of people's minds? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think that HR implements culture, the cultural strategy. The culture is owned at the top of the organization. So John Maxwell has a quote that says, "As go the leader, so goes the organization." So quite frankly, HR can only implement what is on the mind or the characterization of the leader at the very, very top of the organization. So when I say it's got to be on the agenda, it's got to be on the agenda of the executive team. And it has got to happen as a leadership team, how we want to see that done. And then HR is in charge of the implementation strategy. So how do we measure performance? How do we measure engagement and all of those pieces? They have to be part of the strategy from the ownership. So you want to see the CHRO in the executive team. But to me, the executive team, starting with the CEO, that's where culture begins.
Then, start with yourself, then with your team, then you can move to culture. So is that kind of the order, the process that you recommend?
Yeah. And I think it's cyclical, right? So you got to check in with yourself on a regular basis. And it's people who are the teams that have a high level of self-awareness, they've created great relationships. Those are the ones that go to the Super Bowl. So, if you look at history of football, every team that has gone to the Super Bowl, their relationship and how they interact not only started on the field of practice, but they also take that into the locker room. How do I interact and interrelate with folks? And when those two things jive, because they only play one game a week, the rest of the time is about building relationships and everybody from a self perspective, bringing their best self, waking up in the morning and making the commitment to one another that we're going to leave everything better than we found it. And then that's the way it works. And what I've done, I've used a lot of the J2N principles because I really see that as kind of the underlying and underpinning for how we go about leading culture and how we go about leading change. Because what I'm doing right now is bringing change to this organization. And what we do find, looking at the J2N story and everything else, I kind of see things in a split. There are resistors and there are transformers. And part of the reason that people resist is because there's a fuzzy definition of the desired state. And when we can make that clear by saying, hey, we want everybody to focus on themselves first. We want you to focus on who are you? How are you being experienced by others? That begins to change the resistor mindset into, okay, I see what we're doing now. But most resistors, the reason that they do is because they don't have a clear definition of where it is you're trying to go. Transformers are always in, right? And those that sit in the middle, by the way, they are resistors as well. Because if they're like, I'm just going to sit back and see what happens here. Yeah. You're a resistor. You are not a transformer. A transformer takes these things, they can see the vision, and they can move forward. Resistors may have to work a little bit harder on the vision in order to get them to where you need to be. And then that transition from old land and convincing people that in old land, the resources, the way that we did things, by the way, awesome job getting to what is now old land, because at one point, old land was new land. And let's celebrate the fact that, what old land is, but the time is now to move forward. And by the way, as we're going through transformational change, which is what DEIB is, means you can't go back, because transformation is going from one place to another. If we've ever moved from one apartment or one home to another, I think the people who are occupying your old home are going to hate it if you keep going back there and knocking on the door. They're just going to hate that, right? They're not expecting it. It's new land for them. Stay out of my new land. Go to your new land. You can't keep going back to old land. And once we've made the decision to move forward, it's all of these elements that take us on that journey. And that's what I love about it's the simplicity and the complexity of J2N that is the entire underpinning for my thinking and the way that I transform our organization from a cultural level, so that number one, you can fit DEI and B underneath it, but even more so we can build high performing teams. That is just critical. And at the end of the day, the focus is on DEI and B, but you have to focus on the contextual culture first. Because if your culture is not right, DEI and B can't exist. And I find so many chief diversity officers that get so frustrated because they're trying to drive something that is amazing into a culture that's either not ready for it or won't have it.
And why are they? What is it about the culture it's not ready for it or won't have it?
Yeah, it's RTI, respect, trust, and influence. So if my basic contextual culture does not have a tone of respect and trust in it, all is lost. If you don't have that, DEI and B is not going to work, because DEI and B is foundational to the respect and trust, So it has to start with that, number one, high performing teams. People want to work with each other. There is a tone, and the tone is broadcast so that people understand how they're supposed to work in the organization. And that will lead me. Well, so one of the things that I did at Ericsson and now doing at Premier as well is we are blueprinting the culture. And culture is founded on three principles. Number one, the ability to lead yourself. Number two, the ability to lead the team. And when you have those two things in hand, that gives you the opportunity to lead the culture. So what we're doing right now, at Premier, we're calling it the One Premier Growth Mindset. And what that says is that we want everyone to adopt basically the blueprinted culture that we're creating. And we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're including employees in how we want this to happen. What's the experience that you want at work? How do you want to experience your leader? And, I've been around for a while, and you hear companies all the time talk about their great culture. And I'm like, hey, that's awesome. You have a great culture. But if I got 20 people in the room and asked you what the great culture, describe it, you'd literally get 20 different definitions of great culture. To me, great culture is what you define and then what you grow. So what is the core principles of that culture? What are the things that you live off of? So we start with, number one, self-mastery. That ability for that individual to wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to leave everything better than I found it. That's a core principle that if an organization adopts, it's going to change the mindset for the experience of everyone around them. And not just the people they work with, it's going to change customer interaction. If you're publicly traded, it's going to change investor interaction. It's going to change so many different things. And, so having those principles in place, and what I've done is I've taken my HR experience, my DEI experience, and really focused on getting that culture to where you need it to be. And the reason is you can then put your diversity initiatives in a culture that's actually ready for it. It's like putting a cake in an oven that's not warm yet. That's disaster waiting to happen.
Right.
Because if I put it in, the oven's not even warm, it's, then you turn it on, it's not going to cook the right way. So how do we get the oven warm? And before we put, what we want to be ready out of there, you're always going to get a better product. I mean, could it happen with a cold oven? Absolutely, but it's going to take a while. You're not going to have everybody on board. Everybody is not enlightened or communicated with in the same way. So you have to have that core piece. And we're not asking everybody to, to morph into the same thinking and same person, but you've got to have that same, here's the expectations of you in this company. Here's what makes us work. And what we're doing is making sure that we have those things written down, that the culture is blueprinted, and then we build off of those building blocks. Gosh, I must have worked for 11 CEOs now. And my advice is always, look, if you're expecting a light switch, you've got the wrong person. Because quite frankly, a light switch, there's another word for that, which is window dressing. So if we're putting on a light switch, it means that we're doing things without necessarily taking people on a journey. And we are putting up a flag on quite frankly, property we have not yet bought, owned, or conquered. So you can't go out there and put the flag up. You've got to take the journey. And as you take that journey is going to take time. And, what J2N and these thought mindsets and the opportunity to blueprint the culture does is it accelerates the speed of the journey, because culture typically takes 5 to 7 years. Intentional change takes 3 to 5. So if you want to stick with me for 3 years and, be on the journey, and we're going to do some intentional stuff and you're going to buy into it, I'm in. Hire me right now. I'm your guy. If you want me to come in and turn on a light switch and say that we're doing things that we're not doing and we haven't earned it, we haven't taken the journey to it, and we have no claim to it, we haven't earned the right, I'm not your guy. So I start with number one, talking about what the expectation is. Where do we plan to get to? And, again, something that I learned out of manufacturing is putting together what I call a PHIRR, PHIRR. And this is a way to lay out a business plan for where it is that you want to get to. So I start with the end in mind, and I say, okay, 3 years. Let's chat about what the expectations are. What do you want to see? And I'm going to tell you what we can do to get to 3 years. But a PHIRR is, number one, you define the problem. So what's the problem that you're trying to solve for? And quite frankly, operators love that in that language, because that's what we do in business. We solve for a problem and we get capital because we're solving the problem. So you start with identifying the problem. H is for history. So you write down the history. Where have we been? What have we seen? And why is it? And, I love the simplicity of old land to new land. Why do we need to go to old land? So you give the business case for why old land doesn't work anymore. The resources are dried up. Old land is not going to work for what we want to do moving forward. So that is kind of the underpinning of the PHIRR, if you will. The I is for implications. So what are the implications and the harm that's going to come to the organization if we don't change and we don't move forward? The first R is for the resolution. So what are the ideas that you have that are going to get us there? And then you plot those out. And that's probably the longest of the document that you're creating, because you want to put together a clean plan. And like I said, you don't want a fuzzy definition of the desired state. You want a very clear definition of the desired state. And the last R, which is really important for every single CEO and C-suite officer, is the ROI. So what's the return on investment? How much is this going to cost? What could we stop doing or start doing? And what's the plan for that? So and that's a very, very simplified version, because the X factor that gets thrown into this that people don't always count on is people. People are the most unpredictable factor in any of this stuff. So you've got to have a really good communication plan. And, as we know in change, in order for people to adopt change, there's 3 things that are required: communication, training, and reward. So number one, the communication. What are we doing? Is it clear? Where are we going to? Training. training people on what it is that you need, and reward, that radio station we all listen to, WIIFM. What's in it for me? And when you have clarity on those things, you bring all of those things together, and that helps you to craft your journey. And for me, what I did was, they wanted me to work on DEI and B, and I said, well, let's do a couple of things at the same time. Let's make sure that the culture is ready. So that was how we created the One Premier Growth Mindset, and the two elements of that we're working on right now is what we call self-mastery and real talk. And we're teaching everybody how to do that. So self-mastery is how I show up to others, how am I being experienced to others. And it starts with a basic 360 foundation where we are all going around to one another and asking, what do I look like on my A game? What do I look like on my D game? What do you need more of from me? And what do you need less of from me? The second part of that is real talk. The permission to actually have conversation and be included in conversation and give feedback that is valuable, that is invaluable to one another. And in life, we typically don't have the permission to speak to one another in such a way that we don't feel like, well, if I say that to them, I'm going to offend them or I'm going to piss them off. So what we've done is crafted those two pieces. And, if you kind of think about it, when you're building trust with somebody, there's only two ways to do it. What I say and what I do. That's how people trust you. So working on self-mastery and real talk, the third piece of that is building multi-level trust. Because when I know how, when I'm very intentional about the way I want to be experienced by you, and we can have real talk, feedback conversations, and not only one-to-one, this works in meetings too. Because sometimes we zip tight in meetings and we don't say anything, but here's what we do. If we disagree with something in the meeting, we go and we have the meeting after the meeting. And in the meeting after the meeting is useless and futile and just makes everybody crazy because no actions take place in the meeting after the meeting. It's just whining and people deciding that I'm going to be a resistor instead of a transformer. But what if in the meeting, the leader of the meeting says, hey guys, we need to have a real talk conversation right now. I'm inviting everyone into the meeting. And I want to hear from all of you because your information is valuable, thus raising the value stake again. Your information is valuable to the way that we're going to move forward. So this is the culture that we're working on. And you're sneaking DEI and D right in that because it's the value principle. You're bringing value back in by inviting people in. So if I've got a meeting room full of people, I'm now creating this environment where DEI and B can exist. Why? Because I'm valued. And there's all the other elements of DEI and B too, so we're working on recruiting and all of those other pieces. There are all of those, the things that you always look for when you hear diversity, but to me, it's beyond that.
Right.
Once you bring that in, once you diversity of ethnicity and gender and, and whatever else, how are you going to treat them? How are they going to behave? Is your culture ready to bring people on like that? So it's got to be a few different things all operating at once. And what I've called myself is a cultural engineer, which is the ability to work on several things at once in order to continue enhancing the culture.
Thank you for joining. I hope you gleaned some insights which help you on your journey. If you'd like to learn more about our workshop, which prepares organizations for strategic changes, I'd love to connect.